I spent 40 years building a business empire worth $47 million, thinking I was securing my children's future. Instead, I watched them tear each other apart, fighting over money they hadn't even inherited yet. By the time I was diagnosed with terminal cancer, their greed had consumed any love they once had for me, or each other. That's when I made the decision that would shock them all. I gave away every single penny to charity, leaving them nothing but the consequences of their own cruelty. My name is Robert Harrison, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is teaching them that love can't be bought and respect must be earned. It all started 3 years ago when my doctor delivered the news that would change everything. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, maybe 8 with aggressive treatment. I sat in that sterile office, staring at the x-rays of my own death sentence, and the first thought that crossed my mind wasn't fear. It was relief. Finally, I'd have an excuse to stop pretending my family wasn't broken. I'd built Harrison Construction from nothing. Started with a pickup truck and a borrowed hammer in 1983, working 16-hour days, missing birthdays and school plays. Also, my 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and David, would never know the poverty I'd grown up with. By 2020, we owned the largest commercial construction company in the state, with contracts worth millions and real estate holdings that stretched across 3 cities. But success came with a price I never calculated. The more money I made, the more my children seemed to need it. Not want, need. Like oxygen. Like their very existence depended on my bank account. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. Maybe when Michael, my eldest at 35, demanded I co-sign on an $800,000 house because his wife Jessica deserved to live in the same neighborhood as her sorority sisters. The day he brought me the paperwork, he didn't ask. He announced that I would be helping them secure the loan. His reasoning was simple. He was my heir apparent, destined to inherit everything anyway. So, what difference did it make if he accessed some of that wealth a little early? I remember sitting in my home office that evening, staring at the loan documents, realizing that my son viewed my money as his birthright rather than my life's work. But I signed anyway, telling myself I was investing in his happiness. Or maybe I should have recognized the problem when Sarah, 32, threw a screaming fit in my office because I wouldn't immediately transfer $200,000 for her art gallery investment. She'd burst into the construction company headquarters during a board meeting, tears streaming down her face, wailing about how I never supported her dreams. The entire executive team sat in uncomfortable silence while my daughter accused me of loving money more than her ambitions. The truth was, Sarah's art gallery wasn't an investment. It was an expensive hobby disguised as a business plan. She'd never sold a single piece of art, had no business experience, and her idea of market research was browsing Pinterest for pretty gallery spaces. But she'd convinced herself that my reluctance to fund her fantasy was personal rejection rather than practical wisdom. After that humiliating scene, I wrote her the check, not because her business plan made sense, but because I couldn't bear to see her pain, even when that pain was manufactured manipulation. Then there was David, my youngest at 28, who'd turned entitlement into an art form. The night he showed up at our family dinner, high on cocaine, laughing about how he'd crashed his 3rd BMW that year, was the night I should have cut off his access to money entirely. Instead, I watched him stumble around my dining room, knocking over expensive wine glasses and making jokes about daddy's deep pockets, while his siblings rolled their eyes in disgust. David had never held a real job for more than 6 months. He'd start with grand plans and genuine enthusiasm, but the moment work became actual work rather than playing businessman, he'd quit and come running back to me with elaborate excuses and promises to do better next time. I'd gotten him positions at my company, with my business partners, even with competitors who owed me favors. Every opportunity ended the same way, with David walking out and me apologizing to yet another professional contact. But even knowing all this, I kept writing the checks, kept enabling, kept telling myself I was being a good father, providing for my children the way my own father never provided for me. The pattern had become so normalized that I'd stopped seeing it clearly. Michael would present me with some new financial need, always framed as an investment or emergency. Sarah would have an emotional breakdown about her dreams being crushed by my lack of support. David would disappear for weeks, then surface with debts and drama that required immediate financial intervention. And I'd rescue them. every single time. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't raising children, I was training parasites. Each bailout taught them that consequences were optional, that responsibility was negotiable, and that love could be measured by the size of the check I was willing to write. My wake-up call should have come 2 years before my diagnosis, during what I now think of as the Thanksgiving incident. I'd invited the whole family to my estate for the holiday, expecting the traditional gathering of gratitude and togetherness. Instead, I got a masterclass in entitlement and sibling rivalry that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about my children. Michael arrived first with Jessica and their 2 young children. Before they'd even removed their coats, Jessica was wandering through my house, taking photos with her phone, making comments about which pieces of furniture would look good in their next house upgrade. She'd developed a habit of treating my home like her personal catalog, mentally claiming items for her future inheritance. When I asked about the photos, Jessica smiled sweetly and explained that she was helping Michael create an inventory of family assets. She said it was important to keep track of everything for estate planning purposes, as if my death was an anticipated business transaction rather than a feared family loss. Sarah arrived next, bringing her latest boyfriend, a struggling artist named Marcus, who spent the entire evening asking me about the art collection I'd accumulated over the years. Not out of genuine interest in the pieces, but with the calculating gaze of someone assessing resale value. Sarah encouraged his questions, clearly hoping to position Marcus as an expert who could help maximize the value of her future art inheritance. The conversation during cocktails centered entirely on money. Michael discussed expansion plans for the business that would require significant capital investment. Sarah mentioned a larger gallery space she'd found that would be perfect for her next venture. David, when he finally stumbled in an hour late, immediately started complaining about his landlord threatening eviction over unpaid rent. Not one of them asked about my health, my happiness, or my plans for retirement. They were so focused on their future financial security that they'd forgotten I was still alive and living my present reality. Dinner was worse. Jessica made pointed comments about how the china and silver would need to be properly appraised for insurance purposes. Marcus kept asking about the provenance of various paintings, clearly researching their auction potential. Michael dominated the conversation with business talk, positioning himself as the natural successor to my empire, while subtly undermining any suggestion that his siblings might have valuable input. Sarah responded by listing all the ways she'd sacrificed for the family, emphasizing how her unpaid emotional labor deserved financial compensation. David, too intoxicated to contribute meaningfully, kept making jokes about being the forgotten middle child who deserved a bigger piece of the pie to make up for years of neglect. I sat at the head of my own table, surrounded by my own family, feeling like a stranger at a business meeting where I was simultaneously the product being sold and the customer being courted. The breaking point came during dessert, when Michael announced that he'd been meeting with financial advisors about structuring the family wealth transfer to minimize tax implications. He'd taken it upon himself to research estate planning strategies, not to help me protect my assets, but to ensure maximum inheritance preservation for himself and his siblings. Sarah immediately accused him of trying to manipulate the inheritance distribution behind everyone's backs. David, suddenly alert at the mention of money, demanded to know what plans were being made without his input. Within minutes, my dining room had become a battlefield, where my children were fighting over money I hadn't agreed to give them while I was still alive to witness their greed. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation from the evening. My children hadn't come to my house to spend time with their father. They'd come to stake their claims on their inheritance. They'd turned Thanksgiving into a hostile takeover planning session. But even then, I didn't act. I told myself they were just being practical, planning for an inevitable future. I made excuses for their behavior and continued enabling their entitlement. The cancer diagnosis changed everything, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of bringing my family together, it accelerated their greed into overdrive. The day I decided to tell them about my diagnosis, I called a family meeting at my estate. Not because I wanted their comfort, but because I needed to see who they really were when faced with mortality, mine and the end of their endless gravy train. I gathered them in my study, the same room where I'd built my fortune, surrounded by awards and photos from 4 decades of hard work. Michael sat in the leather chair across from my desk, checking his phone and occasionally glancing at his watch like he had more important places to be. Sarah paced by the window, already irritated that I'd interrupted her spa day to deal with whatever family drama required immediate attention. David sprawled on the couch, sunglasses on indoors, reeking of whiskey at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. When I told them about the cancer diagnosis, the room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then their true priorities revealed themselves with stunning clarity. Michael's head snapped up from his phone, his eyes suddenly sharp and focused. His first question wasn't about my prognosis or treatment options. It was about whether I'd gotten a second opinion and what this meant for business continuity. He immediately started talking about the need to accelerate succession planning and ensure smooth leadership transition. Sarah stopped pacing and turned toward me, but her expression wasn't one of concern for my well-being. Instead, she had the calculating look of someone rapidly recalibrating timelines and expectations. Her first words were about how much time we had to prepare for major changes and whether I'd updated my estate planning recently. David sat up and pulled off his sunglasses, suddenly stone sober for the first time in months. His immediate response was to mention that 6 months wasn't very long to get everything organized properly, and suggests we should schedule meetings with lawyers and financial advisors as soon as possible. I sat there watching my 3 children process the news that their father was dying and realized that they weren't processing my death at all. They were processing their inheritance timeline. Not one of them asked how I was feeling. Not one offered to help with treatment decisions or provide emotional support. They'd immediately started calculating shares and planning for wealth transfer. The conversation that followed was surreal in its callousness. Michael began outlining his vision for taking over the company, speaking about my death as if it were a planned retirement rather than a medical tragedy. Sarah started discussing the need to properly catalog and appraise all family assets to ensure fair distribution. David, with rare clarity, pointed out that they needed to coordinate their efforts to avoid the kind of legal battles that could tie up the estate for years. They were planning my funeral while I was still alive, treating my terminal diagnosis as the starting gun for an inheritance race. I listened to them talk around me rather than to me, making plans for my money and possessions like I'd already died, and felt something inside me break. Not my heart. That had been breaking gradually for years. What broke was my denial. I could no longer pretend that my children loved me for anything other than my bank account. That night, after they'd left my house with promises to coordinate our next steps and set up meetings with estate planning professionals, I sat alone in my study and truly confronted the reality of what I'd created. I hadn't raised children. I'd raised financial dependents who were eagerly awaiting my death so they could access their inheritance. The thought of my hard-earned money, enabling more years of their entitled behavior, funding their destructive choices, and rewarding their callous treatment of me, made me physically sick. I'd spent 4 decades building wealth to provide security for my family, but instead, I'd created a family that saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between them and financial security. That's when I began to consider alternatives. What happened over the following weeks was even worse than I could have imagined. Instead of rallying around me during my illness, my children began positioning themselves for the inheritance battle that they assumed was inevitable. Michael, being the eldest and current CEO of the company I'd handed him on a silver platter, automatically assumed he deserved the largest share of everything. He started making unilateral decisions about my medical care, scheduling appointments with my oncologist without consulting his siblings, and presenting himself to hospital staff as the primary decision-maker for all family matters. His wife Jessica began accompanying him to these appointments, taking notes and asking detailed questions about treatment costs and insurance coverage. But Michael's most disturbing behavior was how he began treating the business as if it were already his. He started making long-term strategic decisions without consulting me, hired new executives without my approval, and began referring to himself as the company owner rather than CEO. When I questioned him about these choices, he explained that he was simply preparing for the inevitable transition and ensuring business continuity during my treatment. The reality was that Michael was seizing control while I was weakened by chemotherapy, gambling that I'd be too sick to fight him and too grateful for his help to question his motives. Sarah took a completely different approach, one that was perhaps even more manipulative. She suddenly transformed herself into the perfect devoted daughter, showing up at my house unannounced with homemade meals and photo albums full of childhood memories. She'd sit by my bedside during chemotherapy sessions, loudly proclaiming her love for me and making elaborate displays of affection whenever her brothers were around. But I could see through her performance. Sarah had barely spoken to me for months before my diagnosis, too busy pursuing her various failed business ventures and blaming me for not supporting her dreams enthusiastically enough. Now, suddenly, she was my most devoted caregiver, texting me constantly to check on my condition and insisting on accompanying me to medical appointments. The transformation might have been touching if it weren't so obviously calculated. Sarah's newfound devotion always had an audience: nurses, doctors, other family members who might later testify to her dedication during my final months. She was building a case for herself as the most deserving heir, the daughter who'd sacrificed everything to care for her dying father. Meanwhile, I discovered she was secretly meeting with lawyers to discuss will contestation strategies, researching ways to challenge any estate plan that didn't give her equal or preferential treatment. Her devotion was entirely performative, designed to position herself for maximum inheritance while appearing selfless and loving. David's approach was perhaps the most honest in its dishonesty. He didn't pretend to suddenly care about my well-being or transform into a devoted son. Instead, he began systematically undermining his siblings while positioning himself as the victim who deserved compensation for years of family neglect. He started spreading rumors that Michael was financially manipulating me during my illness, taking advantage of my weakened state to seize control of assets that should be distributed equally. He told anyone who would listen that Sarah's sudden devotion was fake, that she was putting on an act to curry favor for inheritance purposes. At the same time, he painted himself as the forgotten middle child, who'd received the least financial support over the years, and deserved the biggest inheritance to make up for past inequities. David also began recording our conversations on his phone, claiming he wanted to preserve my wisdom for future generations. But I knew he was looking for anything that might suggest I favored him in my final wishes, or evidence that his siblings were improperly influencing my decisions. The most disturbing part of David's strategy was how he leveraged his addiction issues to claim victim status. He started attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings, not for genuine recovery, but to create a narrative about overcoming adversity. He'd tell his siblings and anyone else who would listen that his drug problems were a result of feeling unloved and financially insecure, and that a substantial inheritance would provide the stability he needed for permanent sobriety. It was emotional blackmail disguised as recovery planning. Watching my 3 children maneuver for inheritance advantage while I was literally dying was like witnessing a masterclass in human greed and manipulation. They weren't grieving my approaching death, they were strategizing around it. The breaking point came 6 weeks after my diagnosis. I was having a particularly bad day, weak from chemotherapy and struggling to keep food down, when all 3 of my children arrived at my house simultaneously. They hadn't planned to meet, each had come to corner me privately about inheritance matters, but fate had other plans. I was lying in my bedroom, trying to rest between waves of nausea, when I heard raised voices downstairs. The voices grew louder, then became shouting, then escalated into what sounded like furniture being thrown around. I managed to drag myself to the top of the staircase, my weakened body trembling with effort, and witnessed a scene that will haunt me forever. My 3 children were in a screaming match in my living room, their carefully maintained facades finally cracking under the pressure of greed and sibling rivalry. Michael was waving legal documents in Sarah's face, yelling about how he'd sacrificed his own career ambitions to run the family business and deserved controlling interest in everything. His voice was hoarse with rage as he accused his siblings of being ungrateful parasites who'd never contributed anything meaningful to the family wealth. Sarah was crying and shrieking back at him, her performance of devoted daughter completely abandoned in favor of raw fury. She accused Michael of being a manipulative control freak who was trying to steal her rightful inheritance while hiding behind claims of business expertise. She kept repeating that she'd given up her dreams to take care of me, conveniently forgetting that her teaching career had been a disaster and her art gallery dreams were funded entirely by my money. David was drunk again, stumbling around the room and laughing maniacally while accusing both his siblings of being fake and manipulative. But his laughter had a hysterical edge that suggested he was more hurt than amused by the family dynamics. He kept shouting that at least he was honest about wanting the money, unlike his siblings who pretended their greed was motivated by love or duty. But what destroyed me wasn't just the fighting itself. It was the words they used to attack each other. Words that revealed how they really saw themselves and each other underneath all the family pretense. Michael called Sarah a gold-digging bitch who had never worked a real day in her life and was now trying to manipulate a dying old man for money. He accused her of being a failed artist who blamed everyone else for her lack of talent and success. His contempt for his sister was absolute and vicious. Sarah screamed back that David was a worthless drug addict who should be grateful for whatever scraps he got, and that Michael was a mediocre businessman who would have been nothing without Daddy's money and connections. She accused them both of being selfish monsters who cared more about inheritance than their dying father. David, in his intoxicated honesty, told them they were all vultures feeding off a dead man, but at least he admitted it instead of pretending to be motivated by love or family loyalty. He said they were all going to hell for fighting over money while their father was upstairs dying alone. And the worst part? They were all absolutely right about each other. I stood at the top of those stairs, dying of cancer, watching my children tear each other apart over money. I wasn't even dead yet to leave them, and I realized I had created 3 monsters who shared my DNA, but none of my values. These weren't grieving children struggling with complicated emotions about loss and legacy. These were predators circling a wounded animal, waiting for it to die so they could devour the corpse. The fight ended when Michael picked up one of my expensive crystal awards and threw it against the wall, shattering it into hundreds of pieces. The sound seemed to shock all 3 of them, back to awareness of where they were and what they were doing. They looked around at the destruction they had caused. Overturned furniture, broken glass, torn papers scattered across the floor, and for a moment seemed to realize how far they'd fallen. But instead of apologizing or showing shame, they immediately began blaming each other for the scene. Michael accused his siblings of provoking him. Sarah claimed she was only defending herself against their attacks. David said he was tired of being the family scapegoat and had every right to fight back. Then they all stormed out of my house, leaving broken glass and overturned furniture in their wake, without even checking to see if I was all right upstairs. That night, sitting alone in my bedroom surrounded by the echoes of their hatred for each other, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my lawyer. James Morrison had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years. He was a good man, honest and direct, who'd watched my family dynamics deteriorate over the years with increasing concern. He'd been present for enough family meetings and business discussions to understand the toxic relationship between my wealth and my children's behavior. When I called him that night and told him I needed to completely restructure my estate plan, he didn't seem surprised. When I explained what I wanted to do, donate my entire fortune to charity instead of leaving it to my children, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said exactly what I needed to hear. It was my money, earned through my own hard work and sacrifice, and I had every right to do whatever I wanted with it. He also said something that confirmed my decision. After observing my family for years, he believed that inheriting my wealth would ultimately destroy my children rather than help them. James understood that I wasn't being vindictive or cruel. I was trying to save my children from themselves, even if they'd never see it that way. The plan I devised with James's help was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its impact. Instead of leaving my fortune to be fought over by 3 people who had already proven they valued money more than family, I would give it all away to causes that actually mattered. But I wouldn't tell them about this decision until after I was gone. I wanted them to experience the full shock of learning that their greed had cost them everything. More importantly, I wanted them to have to confront the reality of who they'd become during my final months, when their behavior would be preserved in legal documents and witness testimonies for anyone who questioned my decision. Over the next month, while my children continued their pathetic performances of affection mixed with legal maneuvering, I quietly began restructuring my entire estate. The process was more complex than I'd anticipated, requiring extensive research into charitable organizations, tax implications, and legal structures that would ensure my wishes couldn't be challenged or overturned. I started by researching charities and foundations that aligned with values I'd always held but had never fully acted upon. I visited children's hospitals where sick kids fought battles far more courageous than anything my own children had ever faced. I met with scholarship coordinators who helped first-generation college students achieve dreams my children had taken for granted. I toured homeless shelters where people with nothing showed more gratitude for basic necessities than my millionaire children ever showed for luxury. The contrast was staggering and heartbreaking. Here were people with nothing who demonstrated more grace, humility, and genuine appreciation than my children had ever shown, despite receiving everything money could buy. At St. Mary's Children's Hospital, I met a 7-year-old girl named Emma who was undergoing treatment for leukemia. Her parents had sold their house to pay for medical expenses not covered by insurance, and they were living in a Ronald McDonald house room while their daughter fought for her life. When I asked Emma what she wanted most in the world, she said she wanted her parents to stop crying when they thought she wasn't looking. That little girl, facing death with more courage than adults twice her age, wanted nothing for herself, only for her parents' pain to be eased. Meanwhile, my healthy, privileged children spent their time calculating inheritance shares and plotting against each other. I decided to donate $15 million to establish a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing construction and engineering degrees. These kids reminded me of myself at their age, hungry, determined, willing to work for every opportunity they received. They understood that education was a privilege to be earned rather than an entitlement to be expected. The scholarship recipients I met had overcome obstacles my children couldn't imagine. Maria Santos was the daughter of migrant farm workers who'd taught herself calculus using library books because her high school didn't offer advanced math classes. James Washington had grown up in foster care and was working 3 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA in his engineering program. These students appreciated every opportunity because they knew how easily it could be taken away. Another $12 million went to the children's cancer ward at the hospital where I was receiving treatment. I'd spent countless hours in those halls during my own chemotherapy sessions, watching families bankrupting themselves to save their children's lives while my own children worried about stock portfolios and inheritance distribution. The pediatric oncology unit needed new equipment that could mean the difference between life and death for children like Emma. The money I gave would purchase machines that could detect cancer earlier, deliver more precise radiation treatments, and provide comfort care for children who couldn't be saved. Every dollar would serve a purpose more meaningful than funding another luxury vacation or sports car for my spoiled children. I allocated $8 million to fund a homeless shelter and job training program in the city, where I'd built my first building. The facility served people who'd lost everything through circumstances beyond their control. Veterans struggling with PTSD, families devastated by medical bankruptcies, young people aging out of foster care with nowhere to go. The job training program specifically focused on construction trades, teaching people skills that could provide stable, well-paying careers. These were individuals who wanted to work, who appreciated the opportunity to rebuild their lives, who understood the dignity that comes from earning an honest living. They embodied the values I'd tried unsuccessfully to instill in my own children. Another $7 million went to a foundation that built schools in developing countries. I'd learned about their work through business contacts who'd traveled internationally and seen the desperate need for educational infrastructure in impoverished communities. Children in these areas walked miles to attend school in crumbling buildings with no electricity, no computers, and often no textbooks. These children valued education the way my children had never valued the expense of private schools and university educations I'd provided for them. They understood that learning was a pathway out of poverty, not a social obligation to be endured until inheritance money made work optional. The remaining $5 million I used to establish an endowment for a financial literacy program that would teach young people the difference between earning money and inheriting it, between building wealth and simply spending it. The program would focus on work ethic, personal responsibility, and the satisfaction that comes from achieving goals through effort rather than entitlement. If my own children had learned those lessons, maybe things would have been different. Maybe they would have become people I could be proud of, instead of people I felt obligated to enable. But I didn't stop with charitable donations. I also completely restructured the business ownership. Instead of leaving controlling interest to Michael, who would have run the company into the ground within 5 years while living off the profits, I transferred ownership shares to my top employees, the people who actually understood the value of hard work and had contributed to the company's success. These were men and women who'd started as laborers and worked their way up through skill and dedication. They'd invested years of their lives in building something meaningful, and they deserved to benefit from that investment. Unlike my children, they'd earned their ownership stakes through contribution rather than genetic lottery. I made sure every worker who'd been with the company for more than 10 years received significant shares in the employee ownership structure. Jose Martinez had started as a day laborer 22 years earlier and was now one of our most skilled foremen. Linda Chen had begun as a bookkeeper and developed into our most trusted financial manager. These people had helped build my success and would continue the legacy I'd actually intended to create. The irony wasn't lost on me. My children, who'd spent years demanding their inheritance based on birth order and family connection, were about to discover that my real legacy was going to people who'd never asked me for anything beyond fair wages and respectful treatment. My children's behavior continued to deteriorate as my health declined and their inheritance anxiety intensified. Michael became increasingly controlling and paranoid, convinced that his siblings were plotting to undermine his position as primary heir. He started working with lawyers to challenge any will that didn't favor him, despite not knowing what was actually in the document. Sarah hired a private investigator to look into my finances, paranoid that her brothers were hiding assets from her or manipulating me during my illness. She'd become convinced that there were secret accounts or hidden investments that weren't being disclosed to her, and she was determined to uncover every penny before the estate was distributed. David's descent into addiction and desperation accelerated as he realized that his inheritance timeline was shrinking. His financial needs became more urgent and irrational, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. The final confrontation came during what would be our last conversation. I was in hospice care by then, about 2 weeks from the end, when David showed up at my bedside reeking of alcohol and barely coherent. He had apparently been drinking heavily for days, trying to work up the courage to say something he'd been planning. He rambled for a while about his financial problems, his girlfriend leaving him because of his debts, his car being repossessed, his landlord threatening eviction. Then he looked at me with bloodshot eyes and said something that crystallized everything wrong with the relationship I'd created with my children. He told me he was tired of waiting for his payday. He said my prolonged illness was putting everyone's life on hold, and he wished I would just hurry up and die so they could all move on with their lives. I stared at this stranger who shared my DNA and felt nothing but pity. Not love, not anger, just profound sadness for what he'd become and what I'd allowed him to become. Here was my youngest child, telling his dying father to hurry up and die so he could inherit money he'd never earned. That moment confirmed every decision I'd made about the charitable donations and employee ownership transfers. My children didn't deserve my fortune because they'd never learned to value anything beyond their own immediate gratification. My final weeks were actually peaceful, despite everything that had happened. I had made my peace with my decisions and found comfort in knowing that my money would do actual good in the world, instead of enabling more destruction. The only people who visited me regularly were James, my lawyer, and Margaret, the head nurse in the cancer ward, who'd become a dear friend over the months of treatment. Margaret told me stories about families who'd been helped by my donations, about children who were receiving treatment they couldn't have afforded otherwise, about parents who could focus on loving their sick children instead of worrying about bankruptcy. These stories gave me more joy and satisfaction than my own children had provided in years. She also shared updates about the scholarship recipients who were already benefiting from the education fund I'd established. Hearing about their academic achievements, their gratitude for the opportunity, and their plans to use their education to help others filled me with pride in a way my children's accomplishments never had. I died on a Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by medical staff who'd become more like family to me than my actual family ever was. My children weren't there, of course. Michael was in court trying to get power of attorney over my affairs. Sarah was meeting with a forensic accountant to analyze my financial records. David was probably passed out somewhere, sleeping off another bender. Their absence didn't surprise or hurt me. By that point, I understood that they had already grieved the only loss that mattered to them, the gradual realization that their inheritance might not be as large or as certain as they had assumed. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday. James had arranged for it to take place in his office conference room, and he'd insisted that all 3 children attend in person. No phones, no lawyers, no spouses, just the 3 of them and the consequences of their choices. I wasn't there to see their faces, of course, but James had recorded the session at my request. Not for legal reasons, but because I wanted documentation of how they reacted when they finally understood what their greed had cost them. According to James, they arrived dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than their father's will reading. Michael in his expensive suit, checking his watch impatiently and making phone calls about business matters until the last possible moment. Sarah in designer clothes she'd probably bought in anticipation of her inheritance windfall, already mentally spending money she assumed was coming to her. David, surprisingly sober for once, probably because he thought he needed to be sharp for the biggest payday of his life. They'd spent the week since my death making plans for their newfound wealth. Michael had already started discussing expansion strategies for the business he assumed he was inheriting. Sarah had put deposits down on gallery spaces and art pieces she planned to purchase. David had made appointments with financial advisors to help him manage his share of the fortune. James started the reading with standard legal language, and my children sat there trying to look appropriately solemn while practically vibrating with anticipation. They'd waited their entire adult lives for this moment, and they believed their patience was finally about to be rewarded. Then James got to the actual bequests, and their world collapsed. To my son Michael, I leave my collection of tools from when I started the business, the same tools he once called embarrassing relics when I tried to teach him the value of honest work. Perhaps now he can learn what it means to build something with his own hands. To my daughter Sarah, I leave my photo albums and family mementos, the same memories she ignored for years while chasing money. Maybe she'll find more value in these than she ever found in our relationship. To my son David, I leave my books on financial responsibility and addiction recovery, resources he needs more than money. I hope he'll finally read them and understand that wealth can't solve problems of character. To my 3 children collectively, I leave this message. You spent my final months fighting over money you hadn't earned, instead of treasuring time you couldn't get back. You chose greed over love, inheritance over relationship, and money over family. I hope someday you understand that the greatest wealth I could have left you was the lesson that some things can't be bought. The remainder of my estate, totaling $47 million, has been donated to various charitable organizations that will use this money to help people who truly need it. Additionally, Harrison Construction has been transferred to employee ownership, ensuring that the people who built this company will benefit from its continued success. James said the silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that conference room as my children processed the reality that their inheritance fantasies had just been completely destroyed. Michael was the first to speak, his voice strangled with disbelief. He demanded to know if this was some kind of joke or test, whether there was another document that contained the real distribution of assets. His mind couldn't accept that the business he'd assumed was his birthright had been given to employees he considered beneath him. Sarah began crying, but not tears of grief for her dead father, tears of rage and disbelief that the money she'd counted on for her future security had vanished. She kept repeating that this couldn't be legal, that there had to be some mistake, that I couldn't have been competent to make such decisions while dying of cancer. David just sat there staring at the papers like the words might rearrange themselves into something different if he looked long enough. Of all my children, he seemed to understand most quickly that this wasn't a mistake or a test. It was exactly what I'd intended. Then the explosion came. Michael started shouting about how this was impossible, that I couldn't have been competent to make such decisions while dying of cancer. He accused James of manipulating me, of taking advantage of a sick old man to redirect money that rightfully belonged to my children. His face turned red with rage as he demanded to see medical records proving my mental capacity during the estate planning process. Sarah's tears quickly transformed into fury as the reality sank in. She screamed that I was a vindictive old man who had ruined their lives out of spite. She accused me of never loving them, of using my wealth as a weapon to control and ultimately punish them. Her voice became shrill as she listed all the sacrifices she claimed to have made for me, demanding to know how I could reward her devotion with such cruelty. David, in a rare moment of clarity that probably came from finally being completely sober, quietly said that maybe they'd ruined their own lives. His comment silenced his siblings momentarily, but only because they were too shocked by his honesty to respond immediately. The room erupted into chaos as my children turned on each other with vicious recriminations. Michael blamed Sarah and David for provoking me with their obvious greed, claiming that his own subtle approach might have preserved some inheritance if his siblings hadn't been so blatant about their money obsession. Sarah accused Michael of being just as greedy while hiding behind a facade of business competence, pointing out that his assumption of automatic inheritance had been just as presumptuous as anyone else's expectations. David laughed bitterly and told them they were all delusional if they thought any of them had behaved better than the others. He said they'd all spent my final months treating me like a dying ATM, and they deserved exactly what they'd gotten: nothing. But the will was ironclad, and James had made sure of that. Multiple doctors had certified my mental competency throughout the estate planning process. The charitable donations had already been processed and legally transferred. The business ownership had already been restructured and filed with the state. There was nothing left to fight over, except the bitter taste of their own greed and the crushing realization that their behavior had cost them everything. The legal challenges began immediately, of course. Michael and Sarah hired expensive lawyers to challenge the will, but they had no grounds for success. The donations were completely legal, my competency was thoroughly documented, and their own behavior during my illness had been witnessed by multiple people who could testify to their priorities and motivations. They spent thousands of dollars. They didn't have fighting a battle they couldn't win, hemorrhaging money on legal fees while the charitable organizations I'd supported were already putting my donations to work, helping people who actually needed assistance. The construction company thrived under employee ownership in ways that vindicated my decision completely. The people who'd actually built the business continued to run it successfully, treating each other with the respect and collaboration that my children had never learned. Jose Martinez, the former day laborer who'd worked his way up to foreman, was elected as the first president of the Employee Council. His leadership was steady, humble, and focused on the collective success of everyone involved. Within a year, the company was more profitable than it had ever been under Michael's entitled leadership. The employee owners had eliminated the waste and inefficiency that comes from having disconnected executives who don't understand the actual work being done. Productivity increased because everyone had a stake in the success, and decisions were made by people who understood both the business and the industry. Linda Chen, who'd started as a bookkeeper and become our financial manager, implemented profit-sharing programs that ensured every employee benefited from the company's success. The workplace culture transformed from one of resentment toward privileged management to one of mutual investment in shared goals. Michael tried to challenge the business transfer separately from the will, claiming that he'd been promised control of the company and had made career decisions based on that expectation. But there was no legal basis for his claim. He'd been an employee, well compensated for his work, but never an owner. His assumption of inheritance had been exactly that, an assumption with no legal standing. The charities I'd supported sent James regular updates on how my money was being used, and he shared these reports with me through the letters he left at my grave during his monthly visits. The scholarship fund had already helped 50 students attend college who otherwise couldn't have afforded it, and Linda Chen, who'd started as a bookkeeper and become our financial manager, implemented profit-sharing programs that ensured every employee benefited from the company's success. The workplace culture transformed from one of resentment toward privileged management to one of mutual investment in shared goals. Michael tried to challenge the business transfer separately from the will, claiming that he'd been promised control of the company and had made career decisions based on that expectation. But there was no legal basis for his claim. He'd been an employee, well compensated for his work, but never an owner. His assumption of inheritance had been exactly that, an assumption with no legal standing. The charities I'd supported sent James regular updates on how my money was being used, and he shared these reports with me through the letters he left at my grave during his monthly visits. The scholarship fund had already helped 50 students attend college who otherwise couldn't have afforded it, and their academic achievements and career plans filled me with posthumous pride. Maria Santos, the daughter of migrant workers who'd taught herself calculus, was now studying civil engineering with a full scholarship and planned to design infrastructure for underserved communities. James Washington, the former foster child who'd worked 3 jobs while maintaining perfect grades, was developing water purification systems for developing countries. These young people understood that education was a privilege that came with responsibility to help others. The Children's Cancer Ward had purchased new equipment that was already saving lives. The MRI machine funded by my donation had detected tumors in early stages that would have been missed by older technology. The radiation therapy equipment was delivering more precise treatments with fewer side effects. Every dollar was making a measurable difference in the fight against childhood cancer. The homeless shelter had expanded to serve twice as many people, and their job training program had achieved an 85% success rate in placing graduates in stable employment. People who'd lost everything were rebuilding their lives with dignity and purpose, learning skills that would provide long-term security rather than temporary relief. My money was doing exactly what I'd hoped, making the world better instead of making spoiled people worse. As for my children, their lives took predictable but still heartbreaking turns. Michael's marriage fell apart within 6 months when Jessica realized the gravy train had permanently derailed. She'd married him for his family connections and expected inheritance. And when those disappeared, so did her interest in the relationship. She filed for divorce and moved back in with her parents, taking their 2 children and demanding alimony that Michael couldn't afford on his new salary. Michael ended up working for a competitor at a fraction of his former salary, bitter and resentful, but finally learning what it meant to earn a paycheck based on actual performance rather than family connection. His new employer had no patience for his entitled attitude or his assumption that his last name should guarantee respect and advancement. The transition was brutal for someone who'd never experienced real accountability. Michael had spent years coasting on inherited authority, making decisions without consequences because he knew the business would always be there regardless of his performance. Now, he was just another middle manager competing for promotions and raises based on merit. His bitterness consumed him. He spent years telling anyone who would listen that I'd been a terrible father who destroyed his life out of vindictive cruelty. He couldn't accept that his own behavior had consequences, preferring to paint himself as the victim of an irrational old man's revenge rather than examining his own. She'd never developed the skills, knowledge, or connections necessary to succeed in the art world, and without my money to fund her experiments, she had to abandon those aspirations entirely. Like Michael, Sarah spent considerable time and energy blaming me for her circumstances rather than accepting responsibility for her own choices. She tried to write a book about growing up with a vindictive parent, but no publisher wanted to touch a story where the villain was someone who gave $47 million to charity, while the victim was someone who felt entitled to inheritance money. David's story was the most complex and ultimately the most hopeful. He hit rock bottom hard after the will reading, spiraling into a destructive bender that lasted several weeks. The realization that his financial safety net was permanently gone, combined with the guilt of telling his dying father to hurry up and die, created a psychological crisis that nearly killed him. But something about losing everything finally sparked the wake-up call he'd needed for years. When he woke up in a hospital emergency room after nearly overdosing, David was forced to confront the reality that his addiction had cost him everything: his family, his inheritance, his health, and nearly his life. For the first time in his adult life, David had no choice but to take responsibility for his own survival. There was no family money to bail him out, no inheritance to look forward to, no safety net to catch him when he fell. He had to get clean or die, and those were the only options left. David entered a rehabilitation program, not because anyone forced him to or because he was trying to impress family members who might restore his financial support, but because he finally understood that sobriety was the only path to any kind of meaningful life. The recovery process was brutal for someone who'd spent years avoiding every form of discomfort or responsibility. David had to learn basic life skills that most adults take for granted: how to manage money, how to maintain employment, how to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. But gradually, painfully, David began to rebuild himself from the ground up. He got a job in construction, starting as a day laborer just like Jose Martinez had decades earlier. The work was physically demanding and humbling for someone who'd never done manual labor, but it taught him the satisfaction that comes from accomplishing something through his own effort. About 2 years after my death, David visited James's office, not to challenge the will or demand anything, but to ask for contact information for the addiction recovery program I'd supported with my donations. He wanted to volunteer, to help other people who were struggling the way he had struggled. James was so moved by the request that he called Margaret at the hospital to share the news. She told him that David had been attending support group meetings regularly and had become a sponsor for other people in early recovery. He'd found purpose in helping others navigate the challenges he'd overcome himself. David never contacted his siblings after getting sober. When Michael and Sarah tried to reconcile with him, hoping he might have some influence or inside information about hidden assets, David wanted nothing to do with their schemes. He'd learned the difference between family and financial transaction, and he wasn't interested in relationships based on money or manipulation. Of my 3 children, David was the only one who eventually understood what I'd tried to teach them. The loss of his expected inheritance had forced him to discover who he could be when he stopped depending on someone else's wealth to define his worth. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh in my final decisions. If there was another way to teach them the lessons they needed to learn without completely cutting them off from financial support. But then I remember the way they fought over my money while I was dying in the next room, and I know I made the right choice. The truth is, I'd failed them long before I got cancer. I'd given them everything they wanted instead of teaching them to want the right things. I'd confused enabling with loving financial support with emotional support. By the time I realized my mistake, the only gift I had left to give them was the hard lesson that actions have consequences. In my final letter, which James read to them after the will, I wrote this: I gave you life, love, and every opportunity money could buy. What I couldn't give you was character, gratitude, or the understanding that family is about more than financial inheritance. I hope someday you find those things for yourselves, because they're worth more than any fortune I could have left you. I spent 40 years building wealth, thinking I was building a legacy. But my real legacy isn't in the buildings my company constructed or the money I accumulated. It's in the scholarship students who will become the first in their families to graduate college. It's in the children who receive life-saving medical treatment. It's in the homeless people who get job training and second chances. It's in the schools being built in countries where education is treasured rather than taken for granted. And maybe, just maybe, it's in the lesson I finally taught my children, that love isn't measured in dollars, family isn't about inheritance, and the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be bought or sold. The employee owners of Harrison Construction erected a small plaque in the company lobby that reads, "In memory of Robert Harrison, who taught us that true wealth is built through honest work and shared success." Those words mean more to me than any monument my children might have built with inherited money. Some people might say I was cruel to cut my children out of my will entirely, but I don't see it that way. I gave them something far more valuable than money. I gave them the opportunity to discover who they really were when the safety net of unearned wealth was finally taken away. David took that opportunity and built a life of purpose and sobriety. Michael and Sarah chose bitterness and entitlement. Those choices tell you everything you need to know about who they really are underneath all the privilege I'd provided. My greatest regret isn't that I died wealthy and gave it all away. My greatest regret is that it took my death for my children to show me their true character. But my greatest comfort is knowing that my money went to people who deserved it, who appreciated it, and who used it to make the world a little bit better. 3 years have passed since my death, and the impact of my decisions continues to ripple outward in ways that fill me with posthumous satisfaction. The scholarship recipients are excelling in their studies and already beginning to give back to their communities. Several of them have started mentorship programs for younger students, passing along the opportunities they receive to the next generation. Emma, the 7-year-old girl with leukemia whom I met during my own treatment, is now in remission thanks partly to the equipment purchased with my donation. Her parents sent a letter to the hospital describing how the early detection made possible by the new MRI machine had saved their daughter's life. They volunteer now in the pediatric ward, offering support to other families facing similar battles. The homeless shelter has become a model program studied by social service organizations across the country. The combination of immediate assistance and long-term job training has proven so effective that other cities are replicating the approach. People who once lived on the streets are now homeowners, taxpayers, and contributors to their communities. Harrison Construction has expanded into green building and sustainable development, initiatives that my employee owners pursued because they cared about leaving the world better than they found it. Michael would never have taken the company in that direction. He was too focused on short-term profits to invest in long-term environmental responsibility. The financial literacy program I endowed has reached thousands of young people, teaching them lessons about work ethic, personal responsibility, and the difference between earning and inheriting wealth. Many of the program graduates have gone on to start their own businesses or pursue careers in fields that help others achieve financial independence. My children's lives have continued on their predictable trajectories. Michael remains bitter and resentful, still blaming me for his circumstances rather than examining his own choices. His relationship with his children is strained because he's filled them with stories about their grandfather's cruelty rather than teaching them valuable lessons about character and responsibility. Sarah has found some measure of peace in her teaching career, though she still struggles with feeling entitled to a lifestyle she hasn't earned. She's developed into a respected educator, but she continues to resent the financial limitations of her chosen profession, rather than appreciating the meaningful work she does every day. David is thriving in his recovery and has become a powerful advocate for addiction, treatment, and prevention. He speaks at schools and community centers about the dangers of entitlement and the importance of taking responsibility for one's own life. His transformation from entitled addict to responsible contributor proves that people can change when they're forced to confront the consequences of their choices. Recently, David was invited to speak at a graduation ceremony for the job training program my donation had funded. James attended the event and later described David's speech as moving and honest. David talked about the difference between inherited privilege and earned achievement, about the satisfaction that comes from building something through your own effort. He also spoke about forgiveness, not forgiving me for my final decisions, but forgiving himself for the person he'd been during my illness. David acknowledged that he'd treated his dying father cruelly and that he'd deserved to lose his inheritance because of his behavior and choices. That speech, according to James, received a standing ovation from an audience of people who understood the value of second chances and the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions. I never intended for my death to become a teaching moment for so many people, but I'm grateful that it has. The story of what happened to my family has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitlement and the importance of raising children who understand the difference between privilege and character. Some business schools now use my case as an example of how inherited wealth can destroy family relationships when children aren't taught proper values. Some family therapists share my story with clients who are struggling with similar dynamics of entitlement and financial dependence. The lesson isn't that wealthy parents should automatically disinherit their children, but that money without character education creates monsters rather than contributors to society. If I could go back and change anything, I wouldn't change my final decisions about the inheritance. Those were necessary consequences for behavior that had been escalating for years. But I would change how I raised my children from the beginning. I would have required them to work for spending money instead of providing unlimited allowances. I would have insisted they contribute to household responsibilities instead of hiring staff to do everything for them. I would have taught them the satisfaction of earning rewards rather than expecting them automatically. Most importantly, I would have modeled the behavior I wanted them to learn instead of working so obsessively that I never spent time teaching them my values. But those regrets are balanced by satisfaction in knowing that my final act as a father was to stop enabling destructive behavior and start supporting people who would use opportunities responsibly. The children receiving scholarships, the patients getting life-saving treatment, the homeless individuals rebuilding their lives, the communities benefiting from sustainable construction practices. These are my true legacy. These are the people my life's work ultimately served. My children may never forgive me for my final decisions, but forgiveness was never the goal. The goal was to stop rewarding entitlement and start supporting character. The goal was to ensure that my life's work contributed to making the world better, rather than making privileged people worse. In the end, that's exactly what happened. My money is being used to create opportunities for people who appreciate them, to solve problems for communities that need help, and to build a future where hard work and good character are valued more than family connections and inherited wealth. Some people build monuments to ensure they're remembered after death. I built something better, a legacy of positive impact that will continue long after my name is forgotten. The children who receive educations they couldn't have afforded, the patients who receive treatments that save their lives, the communities that benefit from sustainable development. They are my monuments. And somewhere in that legacy, maybe my own children will eventually find the lessons they needed to learn. Maybe David's transformation is just the beginning. Maybe Michael and Sarah will eventually understand that character matters more than money, that family relationships should be based on love rather than financial expectations. Or maybe they won't. Either way, I'm at peace with my decisions. I spent my life building wealth, and I spent my death distributing it to people who deserved it. That's not a perfect ending, but it's a meaningful one. The greatest wealth I ever accumulated wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the positive impact my final decisions made on thousands of lives. That's a legacy worth leaving, and it's a lesson worth teaching, even when the students are too stubborn or entitled to learn it while their teacher is still alive.